Hello, and welcome to 9 North Compass program. 9 North is jumping into community conversations on timely subject matter that has been magnified because of current events. Throughout 2021, 9 North will be hosting a series of listening sessions about important topics that impact our communities. I'm Mary Wynn, and I serve as the Executive Director for Fusion Learning Partners, a nonprofit organization dedicated to serving the public and civic sector with programs, services, and events that inspire innovation for the greater good. Now, when we think about the greater good, one topic that comes to mind is our environment, both the natural and built environment, because no matter where you live, everyone is impacted by how land is used. Land use planning is a decision-making process that determines how land should be developed to benefit the community. So how can the choices our communities make about land use today create better futures for everyone? How do issues like climate change, public health, and equity factor in? And what can we as citizens, government officials, and the private sector do to make thoughtful decisions that will drive toward equitable and sustainable land use outcomes? Joining me are planning and community development professionals who will provide answers to these questions and insight into why it is imperative that we rethink our approach to land use planning in a conscientious way that benefits all communities. Our panelists include Terry Tao, Program Director at Nexus Community Partners, and Cameron Bailey, Senior Planner at the Met Council. Eric Weiss, Program Director at the Trust for Public Land, couldn't join us this evening, but Terry and Cameron, thank you both for joining me. We have a series of questions today, but before we dive in, first, I want to take a minute or two for you to tell us more about you, your current professional role, your background, and what drew you to want to be part of this discussion this evening. And Terry, we'll start with you.
Well, thanks, Mary, and thanks to 9 North for having me tonight. Again, Terry Tao, she, her, hers pronouns. I've been at Nexus for about 16 years, and the work we do at Nexus is about building more engaged and powerful communities of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. So my background is actually in public policy, and at Nexus, I train in the Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute, which is a program that gears BIPOC leaders to sit on public boards and commissions in support of a racial equity agenda. But in particular, the topics we train on are around community development, land use, housing, transit, and workforce development. So all the things in community development. So I not only have I done work in these fields over the 16 years, but now I train on them. And then in addition to this land use in particular, I've sat on the St. Paul Planning Commission for 9 years. And one of my roles at the Planning Commission was seeing the St. Paul Comprehensive Plan for 2040. So been very on the ground, understanding land use, talking to community members.
Fantastic. And Cameron, how about you?
Yeah, absolutely. And good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for having me. So Cameron Bailey, he, him, his pronouns, Senior Planner at the Metropolitan Council in the Community Development Division, where I work specifically in the Local Planning Assistance Group. My role is to really focus on providing solar and natural resource technical assistance through the lens of climate resilience and environmental justice, and that they're really one and the same. And that's what really drew me to the council and public service at a regional scale. I've been with the council for about 5 years in different capacities, and having interned and contract worked and then come on full-time as a full-time staffer, being in the transit office and the transportation services, now in land use planning tech assistance. My career before I came to the council was primarily in solar, wind, and heavy highway civil construction, design engineering, project management. Was really drawn to Minnesota by just the wealth and abundance of people power and natural resources and innovation. And while the social and environmental issues we have here are not unique, looking at Minnesota, I felt really optimistic about really being able to realize some sort of impact that is sustainable.
Great. Well, we are so glad to have two such incredibly knowledgeable people to have this conversation with tonight. And again, thanks for being with us. I'd like to begin by looking at each of these issues that we talked about in the intro individually. So climate, health, and equity. And then we're going to talk about how they connect with land use planning and zoning regulations. But let's start with equity. And Terry, I'll ask you first, how would you define equity specifically as it relates to land use?
I think it's important to be explicit about the type of equity. Certainly there's economic equity, looking at different socioeconomic status, gender equity, right? Looking at men, women, trans folks, genderqueer folks, and then disability equity. But I think the one that a lot of folks now are focused on in Minnesota is racial equity, right? So what outcomes are different for groups, different racial and ethnic groups? And in particular for land use, it's really important because so much of place has been dictated by history, unfortunately not very good history, divided by racial lines, policies such as redlining. And so it's really important that as we think about land use, we think about the context of how communities ended up in place.
Right, exactly. And Cameron, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think Terry framed that up really well, especially thinking about equity in terms of land use, and that, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, but how we think of land use and our relationship with land in this place has not been the same. It's actually very new. So I don't want to delve too deep into that, but absolutely being grounded in history and how far back we are defining history and acknowledging the realities of the power dynamics in terms of deciding and who gets to decide what is an appropriate land use and who that land use is ultimately for, and really who's paying for that land use in terms of their life expectancy, the quality of their water, of air, in terms of being able to actually interact with that land in ways that do promote the public good and do so, again, in a sustainable way. So, when we hear about planning for 7 generations out, that's a term we get from Native peoples here in Minnesota, and that's a principle that's not new to this land, and luckily hasn't been forgotten. And I think that's something I've seen really coming to the forefront of equitable climate resilience and environmental planning, and especially land use. It all ties back to our relationship with the land, and that really frames how we treat it and thus each other.
Great. I think people, really resonate too with specific examples. So could each of you share a specific example of both a zoning policy or practice that is inequitable, as well as one that is more equitable? And then what are the impacts of those policies? And Cameron, I'm going to start with you this time.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So the first one that comes to mind for me around this is that I'm a military brat, right? So I've lived in over 17 different metros across the country and in 3 different Canadian provinces. In a lot of places, it's not legal to grow food in your front yard. And so thinking about the implications of that, right? So if I can't grow food in my front yard, then it's now relegated to my backyard. And if I rent, the front and backyard really isn't mine, right? So that already has very much narrowed the scope of who is allowed to grow food to sustain themselves. And then it starts to remove the priority of let's make sure our soil and water and air is healthy where people live so they can grow food that doesn't harm them, but rather supports their well-being. And so, looking at the ordinances that really enact that, the downstream impacts of that are, well, then where can we grow food? Where can we source our food from? And then we look at, well, guess you need a lot of land to be able to grow food, which now is removing the growth of food for people away from where we have large concentrations of people, where most people live, considering most people live in cities. And thinking about that also, right? Most people rent in the city of Minneapolis. So that's actually true of a lot of cities in the US. So also it's kind of asking, who are we saying it's okay to be able to grow their own food? And very quickly we see a class stratification. And then if most people are in cities and it's not legal to grow food in your front yard in most cities, then we're pushing the production of food outside of the city, which is now creating a disconnect between people's relationship with land and the place which they live, when really it signals this isn't a place for you to sustain yourself from the ground. So now you have a dependency on a much larger, really international scale food system. So where the accountability mechanisms and the checks and balances to ensure that we're extracting natural resources and replacing them at a rate where we can grow food sustainably over time. That relationship is broken in that case. And on the other side of maybe a more positive example I've seen recently, and staying within the same sort of context of the front yard, is rain gardens, right, in the public boulevard. And that's really interesting to me, that where there's been a lot of organizing around being able to use the public right-of-way and public space is to really help with managing the quality of water and provide a more aesthetic amenity within the public right-of-way that anyone should be able to access. So that's not quite bending all the way back to food production in your own yard, but it's given me a lot of hope. And I think it's really helped tee up the possibility of being able to grow food and herbs and really serve the natural environment, wildlife, and habitat in your own front yard.
Right, those are great examples, and I love how you tied those two together too. Terry, how about you? What would you say, from your lens, has been something that you see as a specific example of something that's really inequitable, and then one that's more equitable?
I think, let's see. Inequitable, it gets at both, right? The example I was going to give, which was about trying to create, inequitable is when we create policies that don't allow for density to grow, right? And so because most people live in cities, there's only so much land we can develop on. And because cities now are experiencing high levels of growth, I mean, St. Paul is going to be it's over 350,000 people. Like, we haven't seen these levels since, the 50s, right? And so, or for a long time now. But so I think, so then to try to rectify this, a policy example that was trying to say, how do we allow for more density, was the Minneapolis 2040 plan, right? Where they said, it was possible to convert your single family home up, change all the zoning to say you can have up to 4 units. Now, it was possible. Now, what some people read was you must. That's not what the policy stated. The ordinance said you can have up to 4 units, which again would allow for density, because again, we can't build out, we can only build up as cities. And so what that will allow is greater density, but also then just, again, renters, more people who are, or in a lot of cases too, even not renters, many people are living in multi-generational households, right? And so that allows more housing flexibility to reflect different living circumstances.
Really, really good point about, demographic shifts and population growth, which in a way kind of leads into talking about climate too, right? So let's turn our attention to climate now. And I think most people do have an understanding of what climate change is and the dangers surrounding it. But here again, what's the link to land use planning and zoning? And how can people who are making decisions about their communities or even in rural areas, their land development, how can they help mitigate the impact of climate-related issues? And Cameron, let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah. And, I work at the council, so really looking at a regional scale of large core central cities and first, second ring suburbs, and then, some ag communities on the outer fringes of the metro. And the way I would come at this is, we open this up, and Terry, you gave this as well, which is equity has to be grounded in history. Otherwise, you're kind of doomed to repeat the previous outcomes, right? So looking at the history of zoning and land use and planning, we really are in a kind of modern age. It's about 100 years old of how we think about planning and land use, which you'll hear from planners called Euclidean zoning. And that came about in the early 90s when lakes were catching on fire across the United States, because in our age of industrialization, we said it was worth sacrificing certain bodies of water and worth sacrificing people's life expectancy to support industrialization to produce a healthier society. So at that time, we had so much pollution pouring into our water, our lakes, our streams, our soil, that literally water, which, is the essence of life, was flammable. And so our response at that time, instead of, well, let's address the core issue, which is all this pollution we're creating to support this larger economy of mass scale manufacturing. Our solution at the time instead was Euclidean zoning, which says, well, we just need to move people away from where the pollution is rather than addressing the source of the pollution. And so what happens is for folk who were able to use, workforce housing that sited really closely to your place of employment, where majority of people were able to walk to work, able to walk to the grocery store because there weren't automobiles en masse at that point. What that meant was now we need an expanded transit system. We need an expanded transportation system. We need an entire new housing system. And if you're thinking about the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, what happened in that time period? What happened was the Freeway Act and the expansion of the freeway system, which also supported the development of our suburban housing system, which was greatly encouraged and explicitly encouraged by white flight and redlining. And that really created a huge generational upswell in wealth, specifically for white WASP culture folk in the US, and explicitly extracted that value from all the Black, Native, Chinese folk left in core cities across the United States. And then so today, where we're at is we have this huge transportation system where the average commute time is about half an hour in the US. And so transportation emissions. And then we don't allow people to grow food in their yards and and we don't encourage it at a scale where people can feed themselves at a neighborhood or even a city scale. So now we have a massive global food system, which accounts for about a third of greenhouse gas emissions, the other third from our transportation system, and that last third from land use and how efficiently we use the homes we're in. As Terry pointed out, if you have a multi-generational household, that's a much more efficient use of land to house people. And we know multifamily homes that are larger, but more importantly, more dense in terms of how many people live in each square foot of land. It's much more efficient from an energy consumption perspective. So while we're greening the grid with renewable energies and more energy efficient appliances, we're actually still growing our demand and consumption of natural resources at a greater rate by continuing to suburbanize and sprawl, which is why you've started to see more of a focus on greater density, as Terry was talking to, for more effective delivery of really public services that have a lower emissions footprint and are more accessible, such as transit-oriented development, right? And such as the concept of the 10-minute city or the walkable city, where we're really redesigning our livable community such that you don't need a car to drive to the grocery store, to drive to the gym, to drive to see friends, but rather you can walk and experience all those amenities at a much more human pace, which is what walking is.
Right, and you mentioned walking, and I think that's a great segue into the next piece of this, which is about health, right? And so Terry, health is another major issue that's confronting our society right now, whether it's individual health issues like obesity or public health issues like a global pandemic. How, again, can the decisions that are made around land use have a positive impact on our health?
Yeah, I think the important context and what's growing, what I appreciate about land use and the planning field now is that we are more and more, we are looking at the social determinants of health, right? We are saying that our health outcomes, very small, not very small, but 40% of it is related to diet, exercise, but meaning the majority of it is about environmental and social features. So if we don't live in decent housing, if we're in areas where there's high levels of pollution, and if we overlay those maps where brownfields and polluted sites are, we will find there are oftentimes in poor communities of color, black and brown communities. And so place matters. And not only does place matters for health outcomes, but what we're also learning is that income overlays with that. Dr. Anthony Eiton from the California Endowment has a statistic that talks about for every $10,000 of income you add to your household, you increase your life expectancy by 10 years. So we start to see all these pieces become interrelated, and that your health outcome, now your zip code is going to be predicting your health outcome. So as we think about land use, it's really incumbent upon us to think about green space and so many other and the other things that we need to make sure people can have access, not just about healthy access, but can also participate in activities that help improve their health. What something our other presenter couldn't be here tonight wanted to mention too was, especially in this time of a global pandemic, as we move from individual collective health, but how people need to feel more connected, right? Everyone's been at home, everyone feels stressed. My dentist talks about the huge amounts of people she's seeing who are clenching their teeth over the past year, right? And so as a result of, just being inside and being not responding to the pandemic in that way. And so we need to think about how land use is built too, so that we can stay better connected to each other, because we need each other too.
That is an incredible point. And, I think throughout this conversation, as we've looked at, equity first and then climate and then health, it's clear that there is such an intersection between these issues. But let's delve into that intersection a little bit deeper. And I'm hoping both of you can talk about this, how those issues are intertwined, but more importantly, maybe what are some effective approaches or practical tools that communities can use to ensure that they're keeping all of those issues front and center when planning? Terry, I'm going to go to you first, and then Cameron.
Front and center when planning, I think certainly looking at data, right? And so there's a number of different really great, actually the Met Council where Cameron works keeps track of a lot of really great indicators, but I know Minnesota Compass has been keeping track of these things. And it's really important to understand what the baseline looks like in your neighborhood, right? We can't, improve on things unless we know where we're starting from originally. So I really think having a sense of what are healthy outcomes in your neighborhood, how many people, what are the asthma rates, right? Really helps inform, as well as coupled with things like what is that overlaid with the number of people who live in poverty, right? And so the number of people who live, in various different types of households. That will tell us where we start, so we can at least have a sense of what our community looks like before we can identify, solutions and tools. We need to go back to the data.
Yeah, for sure. And Cameron, what other tools or resources, either at the Met Council or other things that you know about that communities could use?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that Terry shared data, and really think about like what is data. And it's a way of quantifying lived experiences and narratives. So depending on who you're asking, will tell you what the data says, which we then use to say, well, this is reflective of reality. So this must be how we need to respond to that. And so thinking about how really that's based in relationships. What are the relationships between you and your neighbors? What are the relationships between your government, your implementing agencies, your legislators, and those most impacted, most negatively, as well as positively impacted, right, by our current systems around climate change, health, equity, housing. And, I wanted to make sure I backed up also to these ideas of like the 10-minute city and the walkable city, right? Those are if we build it, they will come and this will happen. But what's missing from there is grounding that design and those design principles and the realities of race and class and xenophobia and language and sexism and patriarchy. And so bringing all those isms up to frame that around, well, who is able not only to have access, but as Terry said, to actually use those things. Just leaving something at access is really a way of washing our hands of any moral culpability. We put it there, they didn't use it. So in that the very frame of thought, saying they didn't use it, that's saying you're not seeing yourself as them. So similarly, as we started this off, equity and land use is really a reflection, inequities with land use is a reflection of broken relationships between people and place and land. So on the other side of that, it has to be relational as well. And that data should be an indicator of a healing relationship between people and place. So thinking again of like transit-oriented design, or TOD, says dense housing with mixed use so you can shop and have fun and play. And as Terry said, you can have green public spaces that provide amenities that we know are really healthy for humans. Humans are really healthy when we're in nature and we're around people that we feel are, our friends who care about us. So if we're only developing transit-oriented design of walkable city communities such that only folk making more than $25 an hour are able to use those spaces, then we're creating we're reinforcing an existing class stratification. And we know in this country, class is very much reflective, or I should say is very much reflective of our racial history in this country, which you can kind of work your way from the bottom up of the color palette from darkest to lightest across income. And so really bringing in that intersection and that prioritizing the social infrastructure that actually underlies our physical infrastructure and design principles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad you brought up the whole relational piece and you brought it back to equity, because I think the other thing around all of these decisions, right, it's like everything else. Who is at the table making these decisions matters. Who those decision makers hear from matters. So Terry, how can community leaders ensure that they are being inclusive and equitable about who is participating on their planning commissions or advisory committees, as well as how they're listening to their constituents?
Yeah. I mean, I will say the answer before was to see who's there is look at the data. I mean, at least get to parity, right? If you have, 10% of your residents, 25% of them live in poverty, we should try to get that many people on those decision-making bodies. Because then you get at the very least numerical representation in the parity. But on top of that, we need to be intentional about how we go do outreach too, and connect with people, right? So much of government, I think public boards and commissions are about they come to us. Well, I think it really is about how we go to the people. And how, and really flip that, because when we do the deep engagement, it's when we see who comes to the table, it's when we find out what's not working for people right now, right? And so it's been, just on an off note, I've been having conversations about the vaccine rollout with friends. And what we've realized are the very small slivers of people we're not getting to. And that's the same thing as it's a small number, it's one person, but that one person actually represents probably 1,000 other people. And so that's actually a large group of people. So when we think about, the voices that are missing at a table, I think community leaders need to make sure that they are talking to, engaging and out there where people are already meeting. And then once people get seated, I would really say too, like onboard them, right? Get them on board, teach them the process. In planning, there's a lot of acronyms. It's alphabet soup, right? It's a very technical field. And so how do you get people comfortable? And even in the policy space, it's a very technical field and it will take you a couple months to get acclimated. So just like we talk about an organizational culture, if you're applying for a job, we talk about the same thing about a commission culture or a board culture. So we have to be cognizant of these things that are operating at the same time we're doing the work of the commission or the board too.
Those are great points. And I know you're doing great work in that area specifically, Terry. So thank you for that. I want to close this evening, talking about what else people can do. People who are tuning into this discussion who are either interested in getting more involved or they want to deepen their understanding of these issues. What advice would each of you have? And Cameron, let's start with you.
Sure. So for me, who identifies and is identified as a Black man, I was not naturally born with an incredible, deep, comprehensive, critical race and class theory. I, basically looked around at the world around me and was like, it's not right that folk are homeless. It's not right that you can work a full day and not be able to afford like food that actually feeds you and is healthy for you. And so, my mom really put me on this from a young age, which is like, ask yourself who benefits from this and to what degree. And really, for me, it's been a process also of like humbling myself to talk with those around me, acknowledging like, I don't know the answers. All I see is what's not good. And on the other side of that, identifying places where I see well, that is good. So a place where I go to a lot of my inspiration, beyond a lot of the leadership development programs that Terry and myself are involved with and have benefited from. Honestly, for me, I look at different case studies of Black and Native communities in Minnesota and more broadly that are practicing a reimagining of what an ecosystem is and an economy is that's centered on the health of nature, just first and foremost. So, what is our top priority? If we want our top priority to be nature, probably a good idea, considering everything we are and have and ever will be is from the earth and is going to go back to it. So that's the framework that I use to really evaluate, is this potentially a good place to be looking for information? And then I talk about it with the people around me. I'm a strong believer in the power of the collective brain. The collective always knows more than any individual, but the collective is only as powerful as the relationship between individuals. So very place-based, very humble, and very, as much as possible, optimistic looking, and having the audacity to believe that the world can and should and will look different someday in a way that is equitable for our climate, for our environment, and from a land use perspective.
Nice. It starts with awareness, and I love that audacious believing. Terry, how about you? What advice would you have for people listening right now who are interested?
In addition to Cameron's great points about learning from others, I think there's a real practical thing folks can do too. You could just attend meetings. I mean, now everything is on Zoom. You can look at agendas online. Even some municipalities post their meetings on public access, as 9 North, or on YouTube even, right? Just do that. Go to the source, right? Go find out what issues people have been discussing. What have they been working on? What are they, what's being brought to the table? What are people saying in public testimony? We're actually seeing increased public participation because now we can do it from our homes. They are meeting us where we are at. I don't have to find parking, right? I don't have to go downtown and pay for a meter that will expire, then I'll get a ticket, right? So instead, just start very much at that level. Ask questions, right? I think it just in our program this year, in fact, over the past year in 2020, we've been talking a lot about democracy, right? And it's only as good as how we participate in it. And these broader issues of governance is really important. It's hard because we're trying to get to sometimes consensus, or we are trying to do in different strategies for different groups, but with the hopes that the outcomes are the same for people. So, and it's also how we take care of each other. I love Cameron's points about relationships because it really is. Governance is how we take care of each other. Not only that, but how we're going to take care of the earth too.
Love that. You guys have really provided so much experience, wisdom, and knowledge, and so many great things for us to think about, both on a practical level, but also, on an aspirational level. And so I want to thank both of you, Terry Tao and Cameron Bailey, for sharing your expertise and your wisdom with us today. And even though Eric Weiss couldn't join us this evening, I also want to thank him for helping us to prepare for this conversation. Again, your valuable insights have given us a deeper understanding and really more perspective as to why and how our communities need to adapt land use decision-making processes that can better serve everyone now, and as Cameron said earlier, for the 7 generations to come. I also want to thank all of you who watch this program. If you're interested in learning more about these and other important land use related issues, Fusion Learning Partners will be hosting a virtual land use conference this summer. It's open to anyone who's interested in engaging in planning and developing their communities. And so for more information, please go to fusionlp.org/land use. Again, that's fusionlp.org/land use. And finally, a big thank you to 9 North for hosting this session. And for more programs like this, check out their new website, www.9north.org. And please follow and share them on social media below. So again, thanks to everybody and thanks for tuning in.